Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Autism Acceptance Month event. Today's speaker and topic are very different from our past focus in these invited talks, which are usually on scientific research focused on environmental influences in autism. What we'll hear today is about the importance of engaging autistic people meaningfully in everything that is about them and affects them. We'll hear about how assumptions and the actions based on those assumptions are oftentimes wrong and can actually have unintended negative consequences to autistic people in everything from policy to even the language that we use. Our speaker today is Eric Garcia, who is an autistic journalist and author of the book, We Are Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. He is currently Washington Bureau Chief at The Independent, and he has previous experience as assignment editor at The Washington Post, associate editor at The Hill, and staff correspondent at Roll Call and National Journal. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Journalism and Mass Communication. You will notice he has a Carolina blue tie on today, fittingly. So I've asked Eric to talk for about 30 minutes, which will give us a full 30 minutes for questions and a larger discussion. For those who are in the room, if you have a question, please walk to the microphone. For those who are online, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself. You can turn on your camera if you'd like and ask that question. You can also type your questions into the chat box. We'll be monitoring that. We may group some similar questions and we can ask those as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric, whose talk today is how excluding autistic people from discussions about autism harms them.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you very much to the NIEHS. It's a mouthful, but feels good whenever I'm back in the triangle. I just say, it feels good to be home. I'm home. And I'm honored that I can come back and speak about autism. I'm honored that I was invited here. Because and I'll tell a story, which was that my first week at UNC, how many Tar Heels we have in here? Yeah, so Fall Fest and signing up for every different club you can imaginable. There was an autism group, and I thought, I should sign up for that. That's Then I slowly came to realize there were no autistic people. It was just like charity group, and I was just like, okay, this isn't what I wanted to do. So the fact that now you can invite me as an autistic person, there are now autistic people whose voices are being heard is invaluable. So with that, let's get started. I just want to start by saying that autism's misunderstandings go back to their beginnings in the public consciousness. And I'm going to start by talking about really the beginning of how we began to discuss autism in the United States. So I live in Washington, D.C. About 2 hours away from me is Baltimore, Maryland. And there was a man by the name, the researcher over at Johns Hopkins University called Leo Kanner. And in 1938, Leo Kanner saw a child by the name of Donald T., a gifted, albeit unusual child. And Donald T.'s parents were sent Dr. Kanner a letter discussing their son. And Donald, his parents wrote, seems to be fully self-satisfied and almost seems to draw within himself. When they brought a child over to his house, Donald never saw asked the playmate a question. And by the way, Donald T. is not the former president of the United States, just for clarity's sake. And Connor also decried the fact that, and Donald T. was one of 11 children that Leo Connor wrote about in his landmark 1943 study in the United States, Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. That's a mouthful, but that was really the seminal study. Last year it celebrated its 80th anniversary, and it really set the benchmark of how we still look at autism to this day. And Connor basically pointed out, like I said, there are very few really warm-hearted fathers and mothers. He talked about how some of the children came from failed marriages. Unsurprisingly, a lot of these quote-unquote warm-hearted mothers were women who were entering the workforce, because guess what? That was a big bugaboo that was going on at the time. So this set the stage for autism discussions. While Connor suggested at the end of his study that the autistic children had an innate inability to form connections, his concept of refrigerator mothers took off. Donald T. became the poster child along with the other 10 children he observed at Johns Hopkins University. It's also important to note that Connor observed, like I said, only 11 children. 8 of them were boys, only 3 of them were girls. And then on top of that, 9 of them were Anglo-Saxon Protestant, 2 of them were Jewish. And if anybody knows Baltimore around that time in the 1930s and the 1940s, you know it was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant area. It was Italians, it was Poles, it was Jews, it was Irish. But guess who could afford to send their kid to be observed by a seminal researcher at Johns Hopkins University? There's people from the upper echelons of society. And this is, of course, not to diminish the very real anti-Semitism that Leo Connor himself experienced before he and many other researchers came. But Donald T. had a very different life after this, after those research studies. After being institutionalized, he eventually found his, John Donovan and Karen Zucker wrote in an article in The Atlantic that they tracked down Donald T., whose full name was Donald Triplett. Donald Triplett lived in Forest, Mississippi. He had a collection of friends. He graduated from college. He got a job as a banker. He enjoyed playing golf. He had friends who oftentimes didn't even know he was autistic. Triplett died last year at the age of 89 in Mississippi, and he lived a fairly autonomous life. He lived a free life. He and his brother Oliver spent time together. There's a whole article about this that Donovan and Zucker wrote about in their book in a different key. I have my criticisms of the book, but it still is pretty comprehensive in tracking down Donald T. But the point I want to make is that he was loved. He had friends. He had a job, and he lived a good life, which is very contradictory to what we thought to what people like Connor and others prescribed as possible for autistic people. So why do I tell this story? I tell this story because this is literally the first autistic person we knew. What was funny was when I was researching my book, I realized that a lot of people, I often noticed, when I was reading about Connor or Hans Asperger in Austria or any of them, I noticed that I would find old articles that would be like schizophrenia, and I was just like, but I don't want to look up schizophrenia articles. I want to look up autism. So and I realized, back then they thought of autism as a symptom of schizophrenia. Very similar to, I'm just on the tail end of kicking the cold right now, so that's why I have kind of a raspy voice right now. There was raspiness, just like how raspiness was a sign of a cold. In the same way, autism was seen as a trait of schizophrenia. But very rarely did we listen to autistic people. In the past, there were excuses for this, some more legitimate, some less legitimate. Autism was largely unknown. It was seen as a deviation from the norm, and autistic people were sent off to live in institutions. And this was a very common thing. How many people read that article in The Atlantic, The Ones We Sent Away? I recommend people read it. It was really good. you know the one I'm talking about. There was a whole generation of autistic people who were sent away to institutions. They were, and parents were told to hide pictures of their children. They were told not to talk about their children. So they basically were invisible. There are countless autistic people who died without being mentioned in newspapers and obituaries for their parents. It was just a moment of shame. But not including autistic people has had consequences. It led to the promotion of misinformation and allocated resources to areas that either did not directly benefit autistic people or were long-term investments that did not address their immediate needs. So this was not the only time that people had ideas about autistic people without consulting them. So like I said, while Connor said that autistic children had an innate inability to form connections, Bruno Bettelheim took that idea and ran with it, with Connor's idea to promote the concept of refrigerated mothers. He famously said that he posited that the central reason for autistic people being the way they are was that the parents wished that the children didn't exist. Similarly, the anti-vaccine movement was largely driven about a fear of autism. It was driven about why are so many children becoming autistic, rather than asking, well, what do autistic children need? What do autistic people need? And when autism entered into public consciousness, the focus was on curing. And so, for example, in 2006, Congress passed what was then called the Combating Autism Act, which was signed by President George W. Bush. And this was focused, the intent was finding a cure for autism. And this is, of course, around the time of the advent of Autism Speaks, which was founded by Bob Wright and his wife, Suzanne Wright, after their son was diagnosed with autism. But the intent focus was finding a cure around autism, something that Autism Speaks didn't stop talking about until around 2015, 2016. So, or at least explicitly removed from their language. So as a result, for the longest time, we have seen a world where autistic people were not consulted, even when we are discussing autistic people. You can also see this in the language that we discuss. So for example, with things like discussing person first versus identity first language. I know that this is a very contentious thing. Well, for the longest time, people thought that parents, social workers, and other people thought that person first language was the best because they didn't want their children defined by autism. Whereas there was just a recent study, I think yesterday, I need to go back and read it, that just came out, that showed that an overwhelming majority of autistic people prefer identity first language because they see autism as inextricable from who they are. So we're moving fast, forgive me. I just want to leave more time for questions so that we have a really good discussion. So what kind of world has this built? According to the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, these are the numbers for spending in autism research as of 2018. These are the most recent numbers that we have. I believe that this portfolio study was released in 2021 or 2022. Hopefully we get some new numbers soon. So 44% of all research money that is spent in the United States of America around autism, this includes things like the NIH and the federal government, but also nonprofits. 44%, or $172 million, was spent on biology. 19% was spent on risk factors, but that's $74 million. But only 6% was spent on or $222.8 million was spent on researching services. And 3%, or $13.3 million, was spent on lifespan issues. Now, I'm not opposed to researching biology. Far from it. We could actually find a lot of things out to improve autistic people's lives. But this is clear, but when we have these skewed priorities, this clearly shows that we're trying to find the root cause of autism, or what makes someone autistic, rather than how to address the autistic people who are in the room right now with us, rather than finding out what is the best way to maximize outcomes and improve autistic people's daily lives as it is. So why has this been the case? For the longest time, other people spoke past autistic people because they assumed autistic people could not advocate for themselves. As I said before, one reason why a lot of autistic people were institutionalized was because, and in Roy Richard Grinker's book, Unstrange Minds, he points this out, that Bettelheim and others advocated for sending children to institutions. Why? Because if you believe that unloving mothers cause autism, well, then you want to take the children away from those harmful settings. Autistic people were often institutionalized, undiagnosed, or misidentified. This is something that still goes on today. There's still a big racial diagnosis gap, though it's closing a little bit. People of color are also more likely to get diagnosed a little bit later. Black people are a lot likely to get diagnosed later. This is to say nothing of language barriers. An Asian American households where English is not the first language, or Hispanic households where English is not the first language. Also, plenty of people are still misidentified as having behavior disorders. So it's also difficult to find self-advocates' work. And this did not just damage autistic people, it damaged their parents. As I said, think about what we did when we told parents that they were to blame for their autism. Think about what it says think about the years of blame that parents felt when they believed that vaccines caused autism. And think about the blame that physicians shouldered when they were told that vaccinating children made their children autistic, instead of focusing on, well, how do we address this? But there's less of an excuse now. So one of the most important things, so I'm 33 years old, so I was born in 1990. So for those who don't know, that was the year that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. It was also the year that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that Congress reauthorized the Education for Handicapped Children Act as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. How many people know about IEPs? So this is the law that birthed it. So what happened is that, and on top of that, as I said before, in the 1980s, there was a change so that autism didn't get a separate diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as a separate diagnosis from schizophrenia until 1980. And on top of that, and then it wasn't until I believe 1986 that PDD-NOS was included, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Asperger's syndrome was not included in the DSM until 1994. So as you can see, there was a lag, and only now we saw there were more people. So now what happened? But as I said before, when we saw these increased numbers, because the IDEA mandated that schools report how many autistic people were being served, we saw an increase in the number of diagnoses, or children who were diagnosed as autistic. But because we excluded autistic people, we instead talked about autism being an epidemic. We talked about autism. We talked about a spike in the autism numbers, rather than saying we're doing a better job of tracking autistic people. We're making sure that autistic people get diagnosed. And so now what we need to do is we need to focus on helping them transition. But now that generation, my generation, has grown up so that they're becoming lawyers, they're becoming activists, they're becoming advocates, they're becoming journalists like myself. And then there's now a generation behind them that is growing up, these Gen Z kids. So there are numerous examples of having autistic people's input now. The Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, ASPIRE program, has worked to include autistic adults. And in 2019 article in Autism, they laid out the guidelines for doing so. The Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee now features autistic people. In addition, in 2014, I believe, when the Autism Combating Autism Act was reauthorized. It was reauthorized as the Autism Cares Act. It is now, I believe, up for reauthorization this year. But judging by how many times the House of Representatives goes through speakers of the House, we don't know if it'll actually be reauthorized. It's a little bit of congressional humor for you. So what I want to say is, I know I'm in a room with researchers. I know I'm in a room with people who do this for a living, and what I want to say is that this is not meant to be an attack on researchers. Scientific research, including research on biology, can be beneficial to autistic people, but it must include input from the community to hear what are the most pressing concerns. These things can work in harmony, and we can actually work to build and improve autistic people's lives. I know that this is much shorter than the presentation that you guys were promised, but I just wanted to open up the room for questions much earlier. So thank you very much. Did I do good? Was that sufficient, Amanda? Or, I just want to make sure. All right.
Yes, thank you. As a reminder for those in the room, please go to the microphone to speak. For those online, feel free to either put your question in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Cool. All right. I'll take your questions now. Hi.
Can I go?
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Andy Rooney. That was a great talk. I'm with the Division of Translational Toxicology. Yes, scientist working on these. And I really appreciate the perspective that you provided in that and a lot of things that, although I have autism-related projects, that I wasn't aware of just in your presentation alone. But one thing I'd like to ask is the emphasis of involving the autism community and autistic individuals. I think that it's something that we're trying to do and probably not doing as well as we should across multiple aspects of science. So in your role as a journalist, either in the autism field or in others, how can researchers that are looking at biology involve the community on a range of issues, either autism or more broad?
That is great. That's a great question. I'm just gonna take on my jacket real quick. Just so like I think one of the things that I always say is that like being a journalist and writing about autism, it really forced me to change how I do my job. I think that as a journalist, I've always been told, don't email questions ahead of time because then you're going to get a canned response. Well, guess what? For a lot of autistic people who are not speaking, that's the only way you can get them. And on top of that, there are a lot of speaking autistic people who, because they have sensory processing disorders, it helps them to get those questions in advance so they can give you a more holistic answer and they can process things. I think the other point is that sometimes having multiple meetings with them, maybe having an off-the-record meeting with them first, and then having a meeting with them afterward. That's been the way that I've done it, and then also learning that sometimes it's best to do it not just So I wrote. I finished doing the research for the book and writing for the book during the beginning of the pandemic, so when we were all home. But a lot of people, they said, could we do it over Zoom, because I was just doing it face to face. So it was really a lot about meeting people where they are. I think one of the things you've seen now is that the internet and social media have made it easier for you to reach out to autistic people and to reach it and to have a pool of autistic people who are willing to talk and who are willing to have their input. I think that now, like I said, there's groups like Aspire. Dora Raymaker over in Seattle I believe it's Seattle, does an incredible job with Christina Nicolatis. I believe Dora is autistic, and Christina Nicolatis, I believe, has an autistic child, but is neurotypical herself. So there is a capacity there now is a capacity, and there are, I guess you could say, navigators who help in the neurodivergent community, who now can help link you up with various people. So I think that now that's the good thing, that there are networks in ways that there previously weren't. They're not as big as I would like them to be. They're not as easy to access as I would like them to be. And obviously, one of the important things to take into account, like I said, is because there's been this gap of not consulting, there is still, I think, a level of mistrust. But that's only going to be fixed by doing it again, and again, and again, and again. But I don't know if that answers your question. So.
It does. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Cheryl again. Thank you for coming today. I have a child. I actually have two children.
Yeah.
One of them is diagnosed autistic and is in 4th grade.
Yeah.
And the other is older and maybe has a lot of things that would be considered autistic.
Yeah.
And every time, I know this is a theme, when you enter the autistic world and you enter the parent support groups, that, hey, maybe it's me too.
Yeah.
Because you like, oh, my kid does that, but wait, I did that.
Yeah.
But masking, maybe that's me. I don't know. So I was curious as to your take on when, as older people, so older people aren't, the early therapies aren't going to help.
Yeah.
So how your take on getting a diagnosis for someone who's older,
Yeah.
whether they're in their teens or almost 50.
Yeah, I mean, well, I joke all the time. I've said that, like, whenever a parent tells me, "Oh, your autism is nothing like my kids," I want to say, "Yeah, well, your autism is nothing like your kids." I refrain from doing that in public, but no, I've honestly legitimately joked that, you should that there should be a buy one get one half off when it comes to when the kid gets diagnosed. There should probably be a diagnosis for the parent as well, or at least beginning of the screening, because guess what, it's genetic, everybody. To your question, yeah, like the other point, as you know, is that there isn't is that because the screening process is designed with kids in mind, and let's be real, it's designed for young white male children in mind. It's very difficult to get a screening and a diagnosis. A lot of times health insurance doesn't cover it. I've heard of people spending as much as like $5,000 for an autism diagnosis, out of pocket. So, because a lot, like I said, a lot of them just don't take insurance. And then, on top of that, there's the social stigma around it, which is like, oh God, you're not autistic. You're just looking for attention, things like that. This is also something that a lot of women experience, or female presenting people experience, or non-binary people experience. Just like you're not, because our preconceived notions about who autistic people what autism looks like is very biased towards males, and particularly is very biased towards white males. So, and on top of that, there's also the issue of even if you get a diagnosis, there's also the issue of disclosure at your workplace. Because do you want to disclose or do you not want to disclose? There was one woman I interviewed in the book. She told me, she says she's never not regretted being disclosing at work. And so many autistic people I know don't want to disclose at work for very valid reasons. Because oftentimes what happens is that employers immediately judge. They don't take in this new information, and it doesn't shape how they view autistic people. More often than not, they bring their preconceived notions and prejudices and they present it onto the autistic person. So there's a lot of there's plenty of reasons why you don't want to diagnose or disclose. As far as services, I think that's the other thing, is that, like I said, it was a pinprick of how much money is spent on services, and that's just for kids. I mean, I imagine it's even lower for research on services and lifespan issues for autistic adults. There was a great study that I was reading that I have bookmarked on my computer that I'm going to try to finish reading on the plane home, about like how autistic people, when they go into retirement, it's really kind of a disorienting experience, just to change routines. And I thought about it. I was like, oh, I hadn't considered that. And then the other thing I was just thinking about, I was like, oh, well, what is Medicare going to coverage for autistic elderly people going to look like? Because we haven't thought of, for a long time, we just thought it was a childhood thing. I was like, okay, well, what is Medicare going to look like? What's Medicare going to cover versus what's Medicaid going to cover? So as of right now, because we are just realizing that this is something that autistic adults can go through, that they're autistic adults, there's just not that much we know. I wish there was a better way I wish I had a better answer, but like there just isn't that much. But there should be. I hope I answered your question.
We have somebody who's got their hand up online, Austin Ferguson. Can you go ahead and unmute?
Hello.
Hello there.
Hi.
Firstly, thanks for coming and giving this talk.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the tension between identity first and person first language.
Yeah.
And while I think that discussion is important, it seems to me to be a proxy for a larger underlying tension of autism as identity versus autism as a diagnostic category.
Yeah.
And I think this comes up in several other, spots of autism, just self-diagnosis, people moving in and out of the diagnostic label. So I guess my question would be, where do you think it's appropriate or useful to view autism as an identity versus as a diagnostic label? What are the upsides and downsides of each?
You
Where
know,
should each paradigm reign?
¿Por qué no los dos? Why not both? My feeling is that because a lot of people when I talk about autism acceptance, they say, "Oh, well, you're saying autism isn't a disability. Autism is a disability. It's included under the Americans with Disabilities Act." And in fact, it was autistic self-advocates who lobbied to include autism specifically in the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. So it is a disability. Like for example, Cindy was kind enough to drive me here because I don't drive a car because it's too sensory overload. When I go, so I spend a lot of my days at the U.S. Capitol. So I take the train. I had to take the train either earlier, before rush hour, or after rush hour, because and just fill up my first few hours of work with meetings, just because otherwise I'm gonna have a bad time if I'm on the metro with that many people on on a Monday during rush hour. Now, but that is a great question because you're right. It is a proxy for a larger thing. I think that a lot of autistic people, and because it's funny, like I've tried being, I'm going to sound like such a grumpy old man right now, but it's just like, I've tried being on the TikTok, I've tried, I legitimately have tried because I know that's where there's a lot of autism discourse going on, but I just can't. And that's okay. Like I realize now, like, look, I'm 33, like it's not supposed to be meant for me. But with that being said, it's like there are some legitimate discussions going on there because some autistic creators are saying like, no, other autistic creators are just making this kind of a quirky identity thing. It's just like, oh, a little quirky thing. But it's like, no, yeah, it is. Yes, it's part of the identity. Yes, it's an inextricable part of us. But also, it is a very disabling thing. So, like, I think it's very possible for those things to be both. It is very possible that it is very. I'll give you an example. So, like I said, it makes it very difficult for me to. I'll give you the perfect example. Like I said, I can't use the. I need to go on the train at different times than most people, but the other week I was looking at press releases, and then like I noticed one member of Congress was bragging about bringing home like a bunch of projects to their to their home district. I'm not going to say who, but it's one of the ones who's very visible on television. And then basically, but then like what was funny is because I do have that kind of pattern recognition and because of the way that I think differently, I was thinking to myself, I was like, wait a minute, didn't she, I'm gonna narrow it down a lot, didn't she vote against this bill? And then lo and behold, I went back and I went to the clerk. I went on the House Clerk's office website and I looked at it. I was like, yeah, she did do that. And then it was just like, and then you know what? Like, I kind of called her out on it. I asked her about it. So like, yeah, those two things can coexist. The fact that I don't drive a car, the fact that I need to like have different accommodations or like that I need to take sensory breaks can coexist with the fact that I can go down these rabbit holes and go down and look at spending bills and look at congressional votes. Those two things can coexist. So, but to answer your question, I think it is a proxy fight for a larger thing. I think a lot of parents, social workers, things like that, they fear autism being the sole defining thing. Whereas I think a lot of autistic people, at least the way I see it, is it's like, no, it is a disability. It's something that disables me. And it's also it's something that makes me me. And those two things can be in harmony. Austin, did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
All right, I appreciate it. I just want to make sure I did.
So we have a question in the chat. this asker is curious to hear the speaker's thoughts on the breadth of the autism spectrum, from very high functioning individuals, including those diagnosed with what was formerly known as Asperger's, and at the other end, individuals who might be nonverbal or have more visible symptoms.
Yeah,
When it includes such a wide
that's
range?
well now we're gonna have some fun. Because yeah, like autism is, you know, for the longest time, I think that it's important to remember the origins of the concept of high functioning and low functioning, which comes, you know, I talked about it in the United States here, but there was around the same time of the research, and Steve Silverman's book, Neurotribes, talks about how they shared a lot of the same research assistants. Over in Austria, there was a guy by the name of Hans Asperger, which is where we get the term Asperger syndrome, who was doing research in Nazi-occupied Vienna. And it's important to understand that the concept of high functioning and low functioning is very much rooted in eugenics and is rooted in Nazi ideology, because like Hans Asperger was like, hey, there are these quote unquote little professors, as they were called, who were kind of useful to the Reich. And then there were the ones who he sent away to institutions where children died. You know, there's questions about whether Hans Asperger himself was a Nazi. You know, I don't care if he had a card. If you're sending children to be killed, sending children to a clinic where you know they're going to die, you're a Nazi as far as I'm concerned, or at least a collaborator. That being said, so I think it's important to recognize that functioning labels are not that helpful. Because they measure what the outside world sees rather than what autistic people themselves need. So, you know, like for example, you know, you talk about nonverbal or non-speaking autistic people. I think it's a much better description to say this person is non-speaking. This person requires 24-hour care. There's some people who talk about high support needs, low support needs. Even there, then that could be sometimes stigmatizing. I don't know how I feel about, you know, I used to use it a lot. I don't use it as much anymore. But like, you know, or you could say this is a person who requires 24-hour care, or this is an autistic person who doesn't need 24-hour care. Or you know, one of the better analogies that I use in the book, that I talk about in the book, are two people. There's this one woman who I interviewed. Her name is Aria. She's a stay-at-home mom. She's a wife. She has kids, but she couldn't graduate college, regardless of, you know, all she did, and she had trouble finding work. And she's speaking, but like a lot of us would consider her quote unquote high functioning, right? Conversely, there's a young man by the name of Hari Srinivasan who, you know, when I was interviewing him in the book, he was a student at Cal. He was non-speaking, but now he's getting his graduate degree at Vanderbilt University, but he's not speaking. So who's the high functioning and the low functioning one there? Because like on the surface, it would look like Aria, who's married and has a family, but she had trouble in college and trouble, you know, and that's not to diminish that Hari had legitimate needs. He talked about them with me, you know, the fact that that sometimes he would make involuntary verbal sounds or things like that in class, or the fact that, you know, his body sometimes didn't do the things he wanted it to do. But, you know, because he had accommodations at Berkeley, you know, he was able to graduate, and it looks like he's doing the same thing now at Vanderbilt. So I think what we've seen is when it comes to autism, you know, a lot of people have said this, I'm not the first one to say this, which is that we used to think of autism spectrum as like a continuum, like more autistic or less autistic. Now I think we see it more as like a color wheel. And it's more like, okay, there's, you know, some people have these traits, other people don't have these traits, but you know, they're no autistic than anybody else. So like, I'll give you an example. This is like kind of the better. This is kind of an analogy, and it's a crude analogy, but like it's you know, it's the best way I can say. So like, I'm Mexican American. I'm fourth generation Mexican American, and my flatmate, but I don't speak Spanish. And my flatmate is, his dad was born in Chile, he was born in Chile, but his mom is white. He speaks Spanish. And we've had this debate before, like who's the more Latino one, and like but and we joke about it, but like because like I would say, oh, Pablo is much more Latino than I am because he speaks Spanish. He was born in Chile. He talks to his family in Spanish, but then his whole thing is, well, like, no, he said, no, you're more Hispanic because you're more, you're not part white, but like at the end of the day, but as much as we may joke about it, both of us are Latino. It's not a matter of who's more or less. And I think it's the same deal with autism.
So we have a Beth Perry. That question, by the way, was from Robin Taylor. And Beth Perry says, great useful answer to the question on high versus low functioning. And Robin Taylor says, yes, thank you. I appreciate your thoughtful response. Lots to think about. I am learning a lot today.
Awesome.
And then we have a question from Maria Schatz. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
Hi there. So I'm a parent of a child on the autistic spectrum. He is grown up, 24 years old, fully high IQ, fully communicative, but exactly as you described, he has problems in college. He did graduate and he's having troubles to find a job. And I don't know whether it's a question or comment. I probably somewhat provocative. I hope you do not advocate that we focus all the attention just on support and not on cure. Because if you ask my son whether he wants a cure or whether it's such a deep part of his identity that he will not part with his autism, he will say, give me a pill. It is a disability.
Yeah.
It is a limitation. He would not ask for that if he had a choice.
Yeah.
So we need still to look for cure if possible. And for people that want this cure, they need to have a choice to have the cure.
Yeah, I don't want to diminish the fact that there are some people who would want a cure. I think that what I've said and what I've argued is that just like in the same way that we wouldn't try to force a cure on deaf people, or we wouldn't try to force a cure on blind people, we shouldn't try to force a cure on autistic people because, and I'm not diminishing the fact that there are legitimate challenges. Like I said, that there are legitimate disabling things. When autistic people having meltdowns, nobody likes having a meltdown. And a lot of people misinterpret meltdowns as tantrums. No, they're not. They are just like, meltdowns are horrible. Anybody who's ever had an autistic meltdown knows that they are hell. It's funny, a friend of mine has panic attacks, and like we were talking about it, it's like, oh, those feel very so, like they're like, you too, yeah, but like, so I don't want to diminish it. I think what I would say instead is that like, I wouldn't force it on anybody. I wouldn't force a cure on anybody. If you want to find solutions to the things that are very disabling, I'm there with you. Like, I would love for there to be things that could help me with sensory processing disorder. I would love for there to be research into the gastrointestinal problems that autistic people face. I would love there to be more research and more focus on the things that cause the fact that heart disease is the biggest killer of autistic people without intellectual disabilities. I would love there to be more research into how to stop seizures and epilepsy, because epilepsy has a high co-occurrence rate with autism, and seizure, dying from epilepsy and dying from seizures is a big reason why autistic people with intellectual disabilities die. So I don't diminish the very real legitimate challenges, and I want there to be research into mitigating the harmful factors, or the really disabling things that while at the same time not forcing them to conform or be something different. So.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. That would be a balanced approach, because if the person is comfortable with himself or herself, that's fine. No reason to force the cure. But many people would appreciate the cure.
I can hear and I can understand why people would. So.
I've got a question for you, Eric. Can you talk a little bit about how some of the discredited science and research on autism, I know in your book you talk about Wakefield and vaccines, there's been,
Oh, boy.
secretin, unproven treatments as well. What do you think the long-lasting impact of those things has had on how autistic people may view current scientific research?
Yeah. Oh, that is really good. That's really cool. I'm really glad. That's a really good question. It was funny. I was interviewing. I interviewed this one person. Their name now in the book they went by a different name than they do now. They're now they've come out as trans. Their name is Ezra Starr, I believe. But they, they're. I think they go by they, them, or or he, him pronouns. But to be safe, I'll just say they, them pronouns for now. Their mom believed that the vaccines made them autistic, and they blamed themselves for a long time. It should be, and then of course there was a lot of research into, shock therapy or chelation therapy. There was a lot of research into, there was a lot of focus in the early days of ABA. It was, it shares a lot of the same DNA with conversion therapy for gay people. I think, as you said, it does lead to a level of mistrust, and somewhat understandably. But I think what needs to happen is just the same way that other marginalized communities. There's a great book. I don't know if anybody's read that book, How to Hide an Empire, that talks about how the birth control pill was used by experimenting on Puerto Rican women. And then, let's not even get into the Tuskegee experiment. Let's not get into twin experiments. There's a long history of using marginalized people for scientific experiments. I think that's where the collaborative issue comes from. I think that what now needs to happen is that we're not. I think that researchers need to say, we're not here to do things to you, we're here to do things with you. I think that admitting a little bit of fallibility, admitting a little bit of culpability goes a long way. I think it's important to recognize that almost as soon as Andrew Wakefield's study came out, there were scientists immediately debunking it, immediately showing that he wasn't doing his proper research. I think that in the same way, there are plenty of let's be real. There's plenty of neurodivergent people probably in this building who haven't been diagnosed, and there are probably a lot more who have been diagnosed who don't want to be open about it. And then there's probably some people here in this room and on Zoom who are neurodivergent, who are open about it. But I think that's one of the other things is like showing how visible and creating a culture where neurodivergent people are visible and are able to be themselves in the research field, I think will create a level of trust to show that there's people within these institutions who want to make it better. I think that you're already seeing this with so many great researchers who are neurodivergent or autistic themselves, and that's only going to continue. But I think it's demonstrating humility. I think is the big thing.
So we have another question in the chat from Stephen Isaacson, who asks, Eric, can you talk about your vision for the future of autism services? And did you receive services growing up?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really great question. So I did. So you have to remember, I was coming up. I was a kid, when I was getting diagnosed. So and again, Asperger's syndrome was only included in the DSM in 1994, so I was about 3 when it was coming out. And of course, all of you are researchers. I'm talking among people. You guys know there's a lag in uptake and people understanding it and entering into the public consciousness. So I did occupational therapy, which was really helpful. I did some speech therapy. I remember when I was a kid, my mom would have to put ice cubes in my mouth, or I would have to sit in a bin and then she would put dry macaroni, just dump dry macaroni in a box with me, or there was this really rough brush, or it's funny how the services I received were so, in some ways, primitive because they were just figuring it out. But in the other way, because it's I'm talking about this with my mom at times, and And she said, and I've said, like, on one end, it kind of sucks that we didn't, that there was still so much, there was a lack of knowledge about at the time. But then on the flip side, I said, we kind of got lucky that that there wasn't so much information about this, because that means that we weren't subjected to a lot of the, I don't know if I can use this word, bullshit or BS or garbage and misinformation around autism. That people do, because I think I know a lot of people who have been subjected to those things. Let's talk about the Judge Rottenberg Center, where people are still subjected to shock therapy. So in some ways I'm kind of grateful for that. But as far so that's the second part of your question. What I see for the future of it is that as of right, I'm very active on social media. I'm sure as anybody who follows me on social media knows. And the question I hate getting more than anything is, what are the services available for my kid as they get older? And I was just like, and I hate it not because it's a bad question, but because there just isn't that many. We haven't thought of it that much. We haven't considered it. So I think what I would love to see is that, as of right now, when you turn 21, your services for special education or disability education are cut off. I would like to see there be more of a transition ramp into adulthood. There was a GAO report that showed that back in 2017, I think, that showed that transition services aren't that great, because they start pretty late. I would like transition services for adulthood to start as early as 10. As early as 10 years old. But that's if I had a magic wand. I think also just having just more than anything, again, looking at how little services are spent, money is spent on services, just increase the budget, just increase because we, one of the reasons why it doesn't exist, why they exist, we haven't even looked into what are the possibilities. So I would just like to see more money spent into looking, what are the possibilities for adults, because as of right now, I don't have an answer, because we haven't thought of what a good answer would be. So that's what I would say.
Hi, I'm Astrid Haugen. So a lot of researchers are studying what seems like causes or biology or what may seem to people like they're searching for a cure.
Yeah.
But many researchers in these fields are also viewing that research as a foundation for where other research can build on that for improving interventions and services. So how do we as a research community better communicate about how our research, which is often far upstream of services and lifespan concerns, is important to advancing our understanding to improve services and interventions?
I think communication is key in that case. I think being upfront and saying that this isn't about finding a cure, this isn't about, I think that now you're seeing this a lot now, there's a lot of talk about gene editing or talking about, designer babies. I think it's really important to articulate that this isn't about searching and seek and destroy for autism, but rather it is a means to build on the services. And I think being as clear and explicit as possible and showing and demonstrating, showing and telling that, okay, this research for biology led to us understanding about this. Researching about this let us understand about that. And then also, I think also, again, going to the point about humility and recognizing okay, this is what we're looking at, but how do you feel about it? Giving honest and open feedback with the community is, I think, is integral, because then what you do is that you get immediate feedback and you get okay, this is what you guys are looking for. And what can this do to, we're doing this research, what can this, how does this serve you? Or what, I think really having an open line of communication is important.
So another question, in the past, much of the listening has been focused on including parents.
Yeah.
And now we're expanding to include autistic voices. However, those for what we can call very high support needs, who may be less able to advocate for themselves, it remains challenging to directly include their voices.
Yeah.
and may require a parent or caregiver to speak for them? Or are there members of the autistic community who can be advocates for them?
I think there's a little bit of both. Like for example, when I was interviewing, I interviewed the mother of an autistic young man who has high support needs in my book, Shannon Rojas Rosa, and she does a lot of advocacy for her son and pushing not to cure him but to accept him. I think that also you can see that autistic people, lower support needs people can advocate for them. But like I think the thing that I always say is that like nonverbal communication is still communication. A meltdown is a form of communication because it is a reaction to outward stimuli, and that's not to say that you can stop every meltdown. Some of them you just can't stop. But I think like as you said, like it's important when you're consulting with parent advocates, and parents can be incredibly important and vital. I'm not knocking parents at all. It's always important to ask, consult, and find ways to consult with the autistic people. Is this what the parents want or what the kids want? Because oftentimes, I would say 95% of the time, those things are in concert. Those things are in agreement. But then that 5% is really important. I think it is necessary. And I think that's where you can have a consortium. Why having a consortium of higher support needs autistic people, lower, autistic people who can speak with their mouth, parents, having that consortium is really helpful because then you're getting a menagerie and a variety of opinions. So that even if you can't directly consult with an autistic person with higher support needs, you're still getting as a variety of opinions.
So Beth Perry has a question. How can workplaces support autistic and other neurodivergent staff? Are there accommodations that are particularly helpful that should be available to all?
Yeah, that was the, I think you've seen this already with some autism neurodiversity in the workplace initiatives. Like some people, they no longer even do job interviews. I think at SAP they use Lego experiments, or some places they do. It's not sitting in a room in a suit and tie. You can do a walking job interview. So I think that's one. I think the other one is, I think ending open workspaces is a good one. I hate open workspaces. But I think more important than any one singular accommodation, I think is taking the need for accommodation seriously and listening to them. And ultimately what happens is when you take them seriously and once you listen to them, it creates a cachet, it creates a tranche of accommodations that you can use for the future for other people, so that when somebody else says I need accommodation, they're like, okay, would this work? Did this work? And then sometimes it works, sometimes it won't work, but like you'll at least be familiar with it, and you can offer different services so that, and then you can adjust accordingly.
I'm going to have the last question.
Please, Cindy.
And I'm going to ask you to grade your fellow journalists. I hope you're not going to get in trouble for this, but I'm curious your thoughts about how journalists cover autism research, especially research about causes. Are those journalists also kind of flavored by, oh no, it's only genetics, and if it's anything, then environment, it's just, they're talking about vaccines and how do you think they do?
I think the journalists, taking into account that my business is going through the same thing that every other business is going through. We're going through cuts. We're going through, we're also on deadline a lot. I think that, but the point that I make to a lot of, is that more than like what grade I would give is I would say like, more than anything, it's going to not be about how you do one story. It's going to be how you do the next story. And I think what really matters more than anything is showing a commitment to covering it and covering it right. Because when I started writing about autism, there's a lot of stuff that I look now and I'm like, oh man, I got that wrong, or I don't necessarily know if I believe that anymore, or I misread a study, and then now I'm like, but like it's just about going back to the well again and again and again, and hopefully media companies allow for that. But as you see, the media industry is in a really dire situation right now. So.
I think our time is up, and I want to, give Eric a big round of applause. This was great. And thank you, everyone that joined us online as well. Great questions, great discussion.